I'm Snooky, and today I am joined by Smo
Hello, hello.
and Cherry,
Hello, hello.
and together we are Hydragames69.
What is this? Marla gasped. The door had chains strung across it from top to bottom. 3 enormous padlocks holding them all together. The links were bolted into the metal frame of the door, and they were heavy, too heavy to cut without special tools. It was all rusty. The whole thing looked as though it had been there for years. Charlie walked up to the door and touched the chain as if to be sure it was real. "This wasn't here," she said, the words sounding insane even as she spoke. "We have to get him out," Jason cried hesitantly, his hands covering his eyes. "Bonnie is going to kill him, and it's my fault." "What's he talking about?" the police officer said, looking at them with renewed suspicion. "Who is Bonnie, and why is he going to hurt your Fred?" It's a robot," Charlie said quickly. "The robots from Freddy Fazbear are still there, and they still work." "Freddy's Fazbear," Dunn's face flushed, and he looked at the door again. "I used to go there as a kid," he said softly, his tone caught between nostalgia and fear. He caught himself quickly and cleared his throat. "He came to life," Jason insisted, no longer making the effort to hide his tears. Dunn bent down to his height, his tone softened. "What's your name?" he asked. "We have to get him out," Jason repeated. "His name's Jason," Marla said, and Jason glared at her. "Jason," Dunn said. He put a hand on Jason's shoulder, glancing at the others with an obvious suspicion. "He thinks we made him say that," Charlie realized. Jason wiggled in Dunn's grasp, but the officer did not let him go, looking at him in the eye to ask the next question. "Jason, did they tell you to say that? What's going on here?" Irritated, Jason pulled free and took a large step back. "That's what really happened," he said firmly. Officer Dunn exhaled a long, slowly vent of frustration, then got to his feet, treading his kind, friendly act. "So, the robots took your friend," he said. "I know what you're going to try and pull," said his tone. "We were in there," Charlie started flattery, keeping her voice level, as if saying it calmly and plainly enough might convince him that they were not telling lies. "Our friend didn't make it out." The officer looked again at the chain. "Look," he said, apparently deciding to give them the benefit of the doubt. "I don't know how you got in there in the first place, and right now I don't want to know. But the machinery in there is old. It hasn't been touched in 10 years. Chances are it's pretty spooky. Heck, I wouldn't want to go in there. Even though I can't blame you for being freaked out, I can guarantee those robots in there aren't moving by themselves. The place is dead and it needs to be left alone," he said with a forced chuckle. Jason set his jaw, but he didn't say anything. "I think you all need to go home," Dunn finished, the statement sounding more like a threat than advice. They looked at one another. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, Jessica looked to Charlie. "These chains weren't there before, right?" She flustered, looking back at her friends for confirmation, like she was beginning to doubt her own memory. "No," Charlie said instantly. "They weren't. We aren't leaving and we need your help." "Fine," Dunn said shortly. "What's his name?" He produced a notebook seemingly from nowhere. "Carlton Buck," Jessica said. She was about to spell it out for him when suddenly Officer Dunn put down his pen and closed his eyes, his nostrils flaring. He glared at them, no longer looking quite so young. I'm going to give you one more chance. Tell me exactly what happened. He spoke slowly, emphasizing the spaces between his words. He was in control again, no longer out of his depth, like he suddenly understood everything. They tried to explain all at once, talking over one another. Jessica's voice was loudest and calmest, and even she could not keep her anxiety from bleeding through. Charlie hung back, quiet. Tell me exactly what happened. Were they supposed to start with the night, with the week, with Michael? Was the first time her father picked up a circuit court. How was anyone ever to respond to something like, tell me what happened? The cop was nodding and he picked up the radio again, but this time he spoke completely. Like I can't apparently right now. Noah, call Buck. It's his kid. I'm up at the old mall site. There was an answering buzz of static, and then an officer turned his attention back to them. Come on, he said. Come on where? John said. Off the property. Marla started to protest, but Gunn interrupted her. I'm escorting you off the property, he said. He pulled the baton from his belt and pointed with it. Come on, Lamar said. Jason was still staring silently at the ground. Lamar gave him a gentle nudge on the shoulder. Jason, come on. We have to do what he says now, okay? But Carlton, Jason said loudly, and Lamar shook his head. I know, it's okay. We'll find him, but we have to go now. He guided Jason toward the mouth of the alley, and everyone followed. The police officer walked behind them, following Charlie a little too closely. She sped up, but so did he, and she resigned herself to being shadowed. When they got to the parking lot, he directed them to wait by the car and walked off a few paces, speaking into the radio again, too far away to hear. What's going on? Jason said. He was beginning to whine. He heard the tone in his voice and tried to moderate it. I am not a little kid, he reminded himself. No one answered, but Marla rubbed his back absently, and he did not move away. Long minutes passed in silence. Jessica sat on the hood of the car, facing away from the rest of the group. Charlie wanted to go to her, but she did not. In her distress, Jessica was closing down, going stiff and cold and snippy, and Charlie did not think she had what it took to break through that without breaking down herself. Was he talking about Carlton's dad? Charlie asked, but no one had time to answer. Headlights appeared, and a car pulled in beside them. The man who got out was tall and thin, and his light hair could have been either blonde or gray. Carlton's dad, Marla whispered. A late answer to Charlie's question. The man smiled as he approached. Carlton's dad, he confirmed. Though since you're all grown up now, you better call me Clay. They all muttered it, half in agreeing, half just to test it out. Jason covered his mouth self-consciously, tonguing the invisible gap in his moles. I thought our days of mischief would be behind us. No, Clay said, his expression good humor. Jessica slid off the hood of Charlie's car, her face drawn. I'm sorry he's missing, she said tightly. I don't know what happened. He was right with us. Bonnie kidnapped him. Jason bursted out. I saw the rabbit took him. Clay started to smile, then stopped himself when he saw their faces. Oh, kids, I'm sorry. You haven't been around in a while. I'm afraid Carlton is playing a joke on you all. All of you. What? Lamar said. Oh, come on. With you guys back in town, he couldn't resist, Clay said. Whatever happened, I guarantee he set it up. He'll probably pop out of the bushes any minute now. There was a silence as they all waited against popular. Probably nothing happened. Well, Clay said at least, that would have been too much to ask. Come on. Why don't you come back to our place? I'll make you all some hot chocolate. And when Carlton finally shows up, you can tell him he's grounded. Okay, Charlie said, without waiting for the consent of the others. He wanted to believe Clay. Wanted to believe that Carlton was all right and would show up laughing. But almost as badly, he wanted to go somewhere where an adult was in charge. Someone who can make hot chocolate and assure them there was no such thing as monsters. Her father had never made that claim. Her father could never have told her that lie. No one objected, and so they started up their caravan again, trailing Clay home. They all settled into their accusement place. Charlie, John, and Jessica in Charlie's car, and Marla, Jason, and Lamar in Marla's car. In the rearview mirror, Charlie saw Officer Don's car still right behind him. Is he just going this way, or is he making sure we go where we're told? She wondered. But it didn't really matter. They weren't planning on fighting. To fight. Okay, sure. At Carlton's house, they filed in through the front door. Charlie looked back in time to see the police car drive on by. He was following us. As they climbed the steps, John leaned in to whisper in her ear. I didn't realize how rich they were when I was a kid, he said, and she stifled a laugh. It was true. The house was enormous. It was 3 stories high, and it spiraled out into the woods that surrounded it. So wide that Charlie thought there must have been whole rooms where all you could see out the window was trees. Blake showed them to the living room, which looked well used. The furniture mismatched, and the rugs dark and durable, made to take stains. Carlton's mom, who you can call Betty now, is asleep, Clay said. The soundproofing is pretty good. Just don't shout or crash around. They forced promise as he nodded, satisfied, and vanished through a doorway. They disappeared themselves over the furniture, sitting on couches and chairs. Charlie sat on the rug between Jessica's chair and Lamar's. She wanted them all to stay close together. John sat down beside her and gave a little smile. Did we get pranked? Marla asked. I guess maybe. I'm not sure what else would explain it, Jessica said listlessly, staring into the empty fireplace. I mean, none of us even knows each other that well. Not really. Maybe he would do something like that. They all shifted uncomfortably. It was true. They had been behaving as if their time apart was just a little break. Like they could just fill one another in on what they had been up to. And it would be just like it was. Just like their group had never split up. But 10 years was too long for that to be true. And deep down, everyone knew it. Charlie darted her eyes at John. She felt a little embarrassed, but she could not have expressed why. Clay came back in, carrying a tray of steaming mugs and a bag of little marshmallows. Here you are. he said jovially. Hot chocolate for everyone, even me. He set the tray down on the coffee table and took a seat in a battered green armchair that seemed to fit him like a coat, as accustomed to his body as he was to its form. They reached forward and took the cup, only Jason reached for the marshmallows. Tay looked around from face to face. Look, he said. I know you don't believe me, but Carlton does this thing like this. Although, I have to admit it, this is probably the weirdest. It's not right, making you relive all the stuff from when you were kids. He stared into his mug for a long moment. I need to have another talk with him, he said quickly. Believe me, my son has a strange sense of humor, he went on. You know, for high school, we sent him to a place in the next town over. No one knew him. He managed to convince his classmates and his teacher that he had a twin brother at the school for the first month of class. I don't know how on earth he managed it, but I didn't find out until he got tired of the act and started getting calls from school that one of my sons had gone missing. Charlie smiled weakly, but she was not convinced. This was different. This is different, Marla said, as if reading Charlie's thoughts. Jason saw him disappear. He was terrified. It's cruel. If it's a prank. Marla shook her head with anger and scratched her nails against the proclaimed cup. If it's a prank, she repeated in a softer tone. She looked at Charlie, her face storming, and Charlie knew that if Carlton had in fact set all of this up, Marla would never speak to him again. Their happy reunion was over. Yes, Clay said. I know, but he doesn't see it that way. He took a sip of cocoa, searching for words. The twins, they had totally different personalities. John was this outgoing, cheerful guy. He was on the debate team. He played soccer, for goodness sake. Carlton had never gotten near a sports game without being forced. I don't know how he kept it up. Still, Marla said, but she sounded less convinced. The worst part was, Clay went on, taking more to himself now than to the teenagers. John had a girlfriend. She really liked him too, but he was just playing the part. Poor girl had been dating a guy who didn't even exist. I think he was surprised when he realized how upset people were. He gets carried away and just assumes everyone is having as much fun as he is. Charlie looked at John, and he met her glance anxiously. We don't know each other, not really. Maybe he did set it up, she said aloud. Maybe, Jessica echoed. I saw him, Jason said loudly. Before anyone could respond, he stormed out of the room, disappearing through a doorway. Marla stood automatically and moved to follow him, but Clay put up a hand. Let him go, he said. He needs some time to himself. I want to talk to the rest of you. He set his mug down and leaned forward. I know you were just kidding around, but I don't want to hear you kids joking about Freddy Fazbear. You know, I wasn't the chief back then. I was still a detective, and I was working on those disappearances. To this day, it was the worst thing I've ever had to see. It's not something to joke about. He looked at Charlie. His gray eyes were hardened, and the lines of his face were immobile. He was no longer the friendly father figure, but the police chief started staring as if he could see right through her. Charlie had a sudden urge to confess, but she had nothing to confess to. I'm especially surprised at you, Charlie, Clay said quietly. Charlie blushed, shame rising up in her with a flush of heat. She wanted to protest, to explain herself, to say anything that might soften the ice that seemed to bore into her soul. Instead, she ducked her head and muttered an indiscreet apology. Lamar broke the silence. Mr. Buck, Clay, did they ever find out who did it? I thought they arrested somebody. Clay didn't respond for a long moment. He was still looking at Charlie, and she felt as if he were trying to tell her something, or else read something in her face. Clay, Marla said, and he seemed to come back to himself. He looked around the group, his expression dark. Yes, he said quickly, we did arrest someone. I did, in fact. I'm as sure now that he was guilty as I was then. So what happened? Lamar asked. There was a hush among the group as if something very important was about to happen. There were no bodies, Clay Buck said. We knew it was him. There was no doubt in my mind, but the children had disappeared. They were never found, and without their bodies, he stopped talking, starting off into the middle, distant as if scarcely aware that they were there. But kidnapping, Charlie said. They disappeared? He was suddenly furious, appalled at the obvious injustice. How can this man be walking around someone? What if he does it again? She felt Marla's hand on her arm, and she nodded, settling back, trying to calm down. But the anger was still there inside, seething under the surface of her skin. He was looking at her with something like curiosity in his eyes. Charlie, he said, justice penalizes the guilty, but it must also protect the innocent. It means that sometimes the guilty get away with terrible things, but it's the price we pay. He sounded grave. His words weighted. Charlie opened her mouth to argue, but this was my price, she wanted to say. But before she spoke, she looked at his face. He had a grim conversation about him. Oh, conviction about him. What he was saying mattered very much to him, and he believed it utterly. It's how you sleep at night, she thought, with an uncharacteristic bitterness. They locked eyes for a long moment. Then Charlie sighed and nodded, giving up the challenge. Intellectually, she didn't even disagree with him. Clay sat up, settling in his chair. So, he said brightly, I think it's a bit too late for you girls to be driving to the motel. Why don't you spend the night here? We have 2 more guest rooms. And you can swell Carlton for his little prank in the morning, he added with a grin. Lamar and John showed Charlie, Marla, and Jessica up to the bedroom, and Jason reemerged as they headed up the stairs, joining the group like he had never been gone. So Jason and I will take one, Marla said, and Jessica, you and Charlie can have the other. I want to stay with Lamar, Jason said insistently, and Lamar grinned widely before he could help himself. Yeah, okay, he said. He glanced at Marla over her brother's head, and she shrugged. Take him, she said. Keep him if you want. So that means someone gets her own room, she went on. Or we could all stay together. I know everything is fine, but I kind of feel like we should stay together. She was voicing Charlie's precise thoughts from only a little while before. But now Charlie jumped in. I'll take the other room, she said. Marla gave her a dubious look. and even John looked a little surprised, but Charlie just looked at them and said nothing. When the door closed behind her, Charlie sighed with relief. She went to the window. It was as if she imagined nothing in view but the trees. The house seemed completely isolated, though she knew that the driveway and the road were just on the other side. From outside, she could hear nocturnal birds and the rustling of other large creatures. On the ground below, she felt suddenly restless, wide awake. Looking out the window, she almost wanted to go outside, to slip into the woods and see what they concealed. She looked at her watch. It was long past midnight. With reluctance, she took off her shoes and lay down on the bed. It was like everything else in Carlton's house, well worn, the kind of furniture only owned by people who have been wealthy for generations, whose ancestors could afford things of such high quality that they lasted for 100 years. Charlie closed her eyes in what she assumed would be her futile efforts to find rest. As she lay there, listening to the sound of the woods, and Jessica and Marla gossiping and laughing in the next room, she felt as if she were sinking into the mattress. Her breath deepened, and she was soon asleep. She woke suddenly, startled from sleep. She was a little girl again, and her father was asleep in the next room. It was summer, and the windows were all open. It had started to rain, and the wind rushed into the room and greeted guests, blowing her bedroom curtains in a frantic dance and ushering in a fine meal. But that was not why she awoke. There was something in the air, something unshakable, that gripped her. Something was very wrong. Charlie climbed out of bed, lowering herself carefully onto the floor. Beside her bed stood Stanley, the unicorn, patient and dedicated, staring at her with lifeless eyes. She patted his nose as if giving him comfort might bring it to her as well. Quietly, she snuck past him and out of the hallway. Uncertain what compelled her, she crept down the hallway, past her father's room to the stairs, and dug down beside the wooden banister as if its open slants could protect her from anything at all. She held fast to it as she made her way down the staircase, letting the rails take her weight as she avoided the boards that cracked. One by one she took the steps. It felt like ages. Like years might pass before she reached the bottom, and when she arrived she might be an old woman. Her whole life spun out in the distance of these stairs. At last Charlie reached the end of the stairs, and she looked down to see that she had changed. Her body was no longer small, night-grown, clad, and barefoot, but her teenage body, tall, strong, and fully clothed. When she straightened from her fearful crouch, she stood taller than the banister, and she looked around as her childhood home startled. This is me, she thought. Yes, this is now. Something banged in front of her. The front door was wide open, and the thudding irregularly against the wall, caught by the wind. The rain was whipping in, soaking the floor and lashing the coat rack that stood beside it, rocking it back and forth like it weighed nothing at all. Leaves and small branches were scattered on the floor, ripped from the trees and swept in. but Charlie's eyes went to her old familiar shoes, her favorites. They were placed neatly beside the map, black, painted leather with straps, and she could see the rain pulling aside and running them. Charlie stood still for a moment, transfixed, too far for the rain to reach, but close enough for the haze to slowly wet her face. She ought to go to the door and close it. Instead, Charlie backed away slowly, not taking her eyes from the boarded rod of the storm. She took a step, then another step, and her back hit something solid. She whirled around, startled, and saw it. It was the thing from her father's workshop, a terrible twitching thing. It stood on its own, bent and twisted, with a narrow, reddish, trained face and an almost human body. Its clothing was ragged, its metal joints and limbs stark and exposed. But Charlie retended only its eyes, the silver eyes that flashed at her, on and off, over and over, blinking in and out of existence. Charlie wanted to run, but her feet would not move. She could feel her plush in her throat, choking her, and she struggled to breathe. The thing, convulsively and slowly jerking motion, its hand rose up and reached out to touch her face. Charlie drew in a shaking breath, unable to duck away, and then stopped, the hand only inches from her cheek. Charlie braced herself, her breath shallow and her eyes screwed shut. But the touch of metal and ragged clothes on her skin did not come. She opened her eyes. The thing had gone still, and the silver light in its eyes was dim, nearly out. Charlie backed away from it, watching warily, but it did not move, and she began to wonder if it had shut down, went out of the finite current that powered it. Its shoulders were hunched forward, helpless, and it stared dully past her as if it were lost. Charlie felt a sudden stab of sorrow from this creature, the same feeling of lonely kinship she felt in her father's workshop so many years ago. "Does it hurt?" she had asked. She was old enough to know the answer. All at once the thing launched to life. Charlie felt her head go light as it took an awkward step forward toward her, hurling its body forward as if it had only just learned to walk. Its head turned frantically from side to side, and its arms jerked up and down with dangerous abandonment. Something shattered. It was a lamp. The thing had knocked over a crimlet lamp, and the sound of it busting on the wooden floor shocked Charlie from her stupor. She turned around up the stairs, scrambling as fast as her legs would carry her to her father's door, too scared to even call out for his name. As she climbed up the steps, some small part of her realized that they were too big, that she was nearly on all fours, tripping barefoot over the hem of her nightgown. She was a little girl again. She realized in a bursting moment of awareness, and then it was over, and being a little girl was the only thing she could remember. She tried again to scream for her father, but he was already there. She did not need to call him. He was standing in the hall, and she grabbed at his shirt tails as she crouched behind him. He put a hand on her shoulder, steadying her, and for the first time, her father's touch did not make Charlie feel that she was safe. Peeking around from behind his back, Charlie could see the thing's ears, then its face as it climbed the stairs in its fitful, jerking step. Her father stood calm, watching it as it climbed the final stair, and Charlie's father grasped her hand and distangling it, gently forcing her to let him go. He went forward to meet the thing in large, even strides, but as he reached out to it, Charlie could see that his hands were shaking. He touched the thing, put his hands on either side of its face for a long moment, as if he were caressing it, and its limbs stopped, its head moving gently from side to side. It looked almost bewildered, as if it, too, had awakened to something strange and frightening. Charlie's father did something she could not see, and the thing stopped moving. Its head drooped, defeated, and its arms fell to its side. Charlie backed up toward her room, feeling her way along the wall behind her, not daring to look away from the thing until she was safely behind her door. As she looked out one last time into the hallway, she could just barely see the glint from its eyes, cast down at the floor. Suddenly, the little silver lights flickered. The head did not move, but in a slow, calculated arc, the eyes swung to meet Charlie's gaze. Charlie whimpered, but she did not look away. Then the head snapped up with a crack like something breaking it. Charlie startled out of sleep, and involuntarily shuddered running through her. She put a hand to her throat, feeling her heartbeat there. Too quick and too hard. She darted her eyes around the room, putting together where she was, one piece at a time. The bed, not her own. The room, dark. She was alone. The window, the woods outside Carlton's house. Her breath slowed. The process had only taken seconds, but it disturbed her to be so disoriented. She blinked, but the afterburn of those silver eyes was still with her, going behind her eyelids as if they had been real. Charlie stood and went to the window, thrust it open, and leaned out, desperate to breathe in the night air. Did that happen? The dream felt like memory, felt like something that had happened just moments ago. But that was the nature of dreams, wasn't it? They felt real, and then you woke up. She closed her eyes and tried to catch the thread, but it was too difficult to tell what was the dream and what was not. She shivered in the breeze, though it was not cold, and brought herself back inside. She took a look at her watch. Only a couple of hours had passed, and it was still hours more until daylight. But sleep felt impossible. Charlie put on her shoes and shuffled quietly through the hall and down the stairs, hoping not to wake her friends. She went out of the porch, sitting down on the front steps and leaning back to look up at the sky. There were traces of clouds overhead, but the stars still shone through, scattered overhead, uncountable. She tried to lose herself in them as she had as a child. As she gazed up at the pinpoint lights, all she could see were eyes looking back at her. There was a noise behind her, and she jumped, whirling to press her back against the railing. John was standing behind her with a startled look on his face. They stared at each other for a moment like strangers, and then Charlie found her voice. "Hey, sorry, did I wake you up again?" John shook his head and came to sit beside her. No, not really. I heard you go out. I figured it was you. I was awake, though. Jason snores like a guy about 3 times his size. Charlie laughed. I had a weird dream, she said. John nodded, waiting for her to go on, but she did not. What did people think of my father? She asked instead. John leaned back and looked at the stars for a moment, then pointed. That's Cassiopeia, he said, and she squinted in the distance of his finger. It's Orion, she corrected. John, I'm serious. What did people think about him? He shrugged uncomfortably. Charlie, I was a little kid, you know. Nobody told me anything. I was a little kid once myself, she said. Nobody tells you anything, but they talk in front of you like you're not there. I remember your mom and Lamar's mom talking, making bets on how long Marla's new stepdad would stick around. What did they come up with? John said, amused. Your mom was banking on 3 months. Lamar's mom was more optimistic, Charlie said, grinning, but then her face grew serious again. I can tell you know something, she said quietly, and after a moment he nodded. Some people thought he did it, yeah, he admitted. What? Charlie was anxious. She stared at him, eyes wide, scarcely breathing. They thought what? John glanced at her nervously. I thought that's what you were asking, he said. Charlie shook her head. Some people thought he did it. I know. I meant, what did they think of him as a person? Did they think he was odd or kind or, I don't know. She trailed off, lost in the magnitude of this new truth. People thought he did it. Of course they did. It was his restaurant. The first children to vanish was his child. The absence of confusion or a conviction. Who else would anyone think of? Charlie shook her head again. Charlie, John said hastily. I'm sorry, I just assumed. You must have known people would think that, though. If not, then now. Oh, I didn't, she snapped. She felt a hollow satisfaction when he drew back. Hurt. He took a deep breath. I know it sounds obvious, he said in more even tone, but it's just never, ever occurred to me that anyone would think he was responsible. And then afterwards, after he committed, but that would have only reinforced their suspicion. She realized as she said it. You thought he was because of the guilt? John said, almost to himself. It was. Charlie felt anger boiling up inside her, the dam about to break, and she held it back, biting off words in short, sharp bursts. Of course he felt guilty. It was his restaurant, his life's work, his creation, and it was all turned into a massacre. Don't you think that's enough? Her voice sounded vicious, even to her own ears. Apologize, she thought, but she ignored it. Drew thought he did it. He wouldn't. He couldn't. But if he had, how would she even know? I knew him, she thought fiercely. But did she? She loved him, trusted him with the blind devotion of a 7-year-old girl. Even now, she understood him with the knowing and not knowing that comes of being a child. When you're focused on your parent as if they are the center of the world, the thing on which your survival depends, only later do you realize their flaws, their scars, and their weakness. Shirley had never had that drawing moment of realization as she grew older that her father was only human. He had never had that chance. To her, he was still mythic, still larger than life, still the man who could dedicate the deactivate the monsters. He was also the man who made them. How well did she know him really? The rage was gone, had ebbed back to wherever it rose from, and she was empty of it. Her insides dry and vacant. She closed her eyes and put a hand on her forehead. "I'm sorry," she said, and John touched her shoulder for a brief moment. "Don't be," he said. Charlie put her hands over her face. She did not feel like crying, but she didn't want him to see her face. She was thinking of things that were too new, too awful to think in front of someone else. How would I have known if he did? "Charlie." John cleared his throat and repeated her name. "Charlie, you know, he didn't do it, right?" Mr. Bark said they knew who did it, but they had to let him go. He got away with it, remember? Charlie didn't move, but something like hope stirred inside her. "It wasn't him," John said again, and she looked up. Right, of course it wasn't," she whispered. "Of course it wasn't him," she said at a normal pitch. "Of course not," he echoed. She nodded, bobbing her head up and down like she was gathering moments. "I want to go back to the house one more time," she said. "I want you to come with me." "Of course," he said. She nodded again, and then her face back up to the sky. Chapter 8. "Charlie!" Someone was at the door, knocking loud enough to rattle the old hinges. Charlie roused slowly, her eyes sticky with sleep, but this time at least she knew where she was. She had left the window open, and now the air coming in had a fresh, heavy smell. It was the scent of coming rain, mossy and rich. She got up and looked out the window, inhaling deeply. Unlike most of the world, the woods outside looked almost the same in the morning as they did in the dark. Charlie and John had gone back to bed soon after they finished talking. John had looked at her like there was more he wanted to say, but she had pretended not to notice. She was grateful to him for being there, for giving her what she needed without having to ask, because she would never have asked. "Charlie," the banging came again, and she gave in. "I'm up, Marla," she shouted back. "Charlie." Now Jason was joined in the game, honking and rattling, and Charlie groaned and went to the door. "I said I'm up," she said, mock glaring at them. "Charlie," Jason shouted again, and this time Marla shushed him. He grinned up at Charlie, and she laughed and shook her head. "Believe me, I'm awake," she said. Marla was fully dressed, her hair a little damp from the shower, and her eyes were bright and alert. "Are you always like this?" Charlie said, her grumpiness only half inverted. "Like what?" "Chipper at 6 in the morning," she said, and rolled her eyes at Jason, who copied her, happy to be included. Marla smiled brightly. "It's 8, come on, there's been talk of breakfast. There's been talk of coffee." Charlie followed Marla and Jason down the stairs to the kitchen, where she found Lamar and John already seated around a high, modern-looking wooden table. Carlton's father was at the stove making pancakes. "It smells like rain," Charlie said, and Lamar nodded. "There's a thunderstorm coming," he said. "It was on the news earlier," he told us. He jerked a thumb at Clay. "It's a big one." Clay exclaimed in response. We're supposed to leave today, Jason said. We'll see, Marla said. Charlie? Clay cried, not taking his eyes off his work. 1, 2, or 3? 2, Charlie said. Thanks. Is there coffee? Help yourself, mugs in the cupboard, Clay said, gesturing to a full pot on the counter. Charlie helped herself, ripping off milk, cream, half and half, sugar or fake sugar. Thanks, she said quietly as she settled herself beside Lamar, meeting John's eyes briefly. Did Carlton come in? Lamar shook his head, a tight jerk to the side. He hasn't turned up yet, Clay said. Probably isn't awake yet, wherever he is. He placed a full plate in front of Charlie, who dug in, not realizing how hungry she was until she was already chewing. She was about to ask where Carlton was likely to be when Jessica appeared. Yawning, her clothes unrumpled, unlike Charlie's. You're late, Marla cheesed, and Jessica stretched elbowedly. I don't get out of bed until the pancakes are ready, she said, and with impeccable timing, Clay slapped one onto a plate, fresh off the plate. Well, you're just in time, he said. Suddenly, his expression changed, wavering somehow between admiration and relief. Charlie turned in her seat. There was a woman standing behind her, dressed in gray skirt suit. Her blonde hair shackled against her head as if she were a plastic toy. Are we a Waffle House now, she asked. She looked around the kitchen briefly. Pancakes, Jessica corrected, but no one responded. Betty, Clay cried, remember the boys. And this is Charlie, Jessica, and Marla, and Jason. He pointed to each in turn, and Carlton's mother gave each of them a nod, like she was tallying them up. Clay, I have to be in court in an hour. Betty's the DA for the county. Clay went on as if he had not heard her. I catch the crooks. She puts them out on the street. Yes, our family is full service operation, he said drearily, pouring herself coffee and settled down at the table beside Jessica. Speaking of which, where's our felon to be? Clay hesitated. Another one of his pranks, he said. He'll be back home later, I'm sure. Their eyes met and something private passed between them. Betty broke away with a laugh that sounded a little forced. Oh Lord, what is it this time? There was a moment pause. In the morning light, the story sounded insane and Charlie had no idea where to begin. With a nervous clearing of his throat, Lamar started to explain. We went up to the mall construction site to go see what was left of Fazzy's Fredbear's. At that name, Betty's head jerked up and she gave a quick nod. Go on, she said, her voice suddenly cold and clipped. Lamar explained awkwardly, and Marla and Jason jumped in with details. After a few minutes, Carlton's mother had a messy vision of the truth. As she listened, her face hardened until it looked plastered. She was a statue of herself. She shook her head as they finished. Small, ripe moments, and Charlie thought she looked like she was just trying to deny what they were saying, but to shake the knowledge entirely from her mind. You have to go get him, Clay, right? She demanded. Send someone. How could you wait all night? She set her coffee on the table more forcefully than she should have, spilling a little, then went to the phone and started dialing. Who are you calling, Clay said, alarmed. The police, she snapped. I am the police! And why are you here instead of finding my son? Clay opened and closed his mouth apathically for a moment before finding his bearings. Betty, it's just another joke. Remember the frogs? She set the phone back on its hook and turned to face him, her eyes smoldering. Charlie could suddenly see her standing righteous before a jury, breaking the wrath of the law.
Hello, hello.
Clay, her voice was low and steady and dangerous, calm. How could you not wake me up? How could you not tell me this? Betty, you were asleep. It's just Carlton being Carlton. I didn't want to disturb you. Did you think I would be less disturbed when I woke up and found him missing? I thought he would be back by now, Clay protested. This is different, he said with finality. It's Freddy. I don't understand Freddy. I know what happened there, what happened to those kids, he retorted. I don't understand. For God's sake. Betty, I saw Michael's blood streaked across the floor where he was dragged from. He sobbed, realizing too late that he was surrounded by the teenagers. He looked around them, near panic, but his wife had not noticed, or Charlie thought he just did not care. Well, you didn't see him, Betty snapped. Do you remember what you told Carlton? Be tough, be brave, little soldier. So he was brave. He was a little soldier for you. He was shattered, Clay. He had lost his best friend, had Michael snatched away right in front of him. Let me tell you something, Chief. That boy has thoughts about Michael every single day of his life for the last 10 years. I have seen him stage jokes so elaborate they deserve to be mounted as proficient art pieces. But there is no way on earth that Carlton would desecrate Michael's memory by making Freddy's a joke. Call someone right now. Clay looked slightly shocked, but he gathered himself quickly and left the room. Charlie heard a door slam shut behind him. Betty looked around at the teenagers, breathing hard as if she had been running. Everything is going to be fine, he said tightly. If he is trapped in there, we will get him out. What do you kids have planned for the day? The question was insane, as if they were all going to hang out at the park or go to a movie while Carlton might be in danger. We were supposed to leave today, Marla said. Obviously we won't, Lamar said hastily, but Betty did not seem to be listening to them. I'll have to call in to work, he said distractedly and went to the phone to make the call. Charlie looked at John, who jumped to the rescue. We were going to the library, he said. We had some things we wanted to investigate. Research. He blushed faintly when he said it, and Charlie knew why. It was abrupt to be talking like this about cases and disappearance and murders. But Marla was nodding. Yeah, we'll all go, she said, and Charlie's heart sank. There's no reason she couldn't just tell them all that she wanted to go back to her old house. Just her and John. No one would be hurt. But that wasn't the problem, even. The knowledge felt too much like exposure. Carlton's mother hung up the phone, done with her call. I hate this, she announced to the room in general, her careful, controlling voice almost shaking. I hate this. Charlie and the others jumped in unison, thrilled by the sudden outburst. And now, like always, I get to sit here by myself, hoping and praying that everyone will be okay. Charlie looked at Marla, who shrugged helplessly. Lamar cleared his throat nervously. I think we'll stick around for another day, he said. There was a pause, and Marla and Jessica jumped in to help. Yeah, terrific. Traffic is crazy out there. Jessica said, high-pitched and forced. Yeah, and also because of the storm, and it's not like we're going to have fun knowing he's missing, Marla said. I guess you're stuck with us. Jessica flashed an anxious smile at Carlton's mother, who did seem to register it. Come on, John said, before anyone else could speak. He and Charlie hurried out of the house and got into the car. Charlie heaved a sigh of relief as she started the engine. That was awful, she said. Yeah, he gave her a worried look. What do you think about Carlton? Charlie didn't answer until she was safely backed out of the driveway. I think his mom is right, she said, pulling it into gear. I think last night we all let ourselves believe what we wanted to believe. All of a sudden, pulled to a stop in the mall parking lot, responding to Chief Barker's order to return. In the light of the day, it was just an abandoned construction site, an ugly blemish on the flat desert landscape. You can't tell from looking if it's being built up or torn down, John thought. Can't tell creation from destruction at a distance. He liked the phrase. He turned it over in his head for a moment, staring at the place. On impulse, he radioed dispatch. Hey Nora, he said. Then she answered crisply, what's going on? Back at the mall for another look, he said. Oh, bring me back a soft pretzel, she teased. He laughed and broke the connection. As he walked briskly through the mall, Dunn was at least grateful the children were not there this time. As the youngest member of the Hurricane Police Department, Dunn always took care to think of teenagers and children. Even though he knew how small the gap between them was, if he could bring them to believe he was a responsible adult, hopefully at some point he would believe it too. Dunn flipped on his flashlight as he reached the entrance to the narrow hallway that led to Freddy Fazbear. He swept the beam up and down the walls ahead of him, but the alley was empty of life. He took a deep breath and went in. Dunn kept to the wall, his shoulder brushing lightly against the rough brick as he tried to avoid the puddles that pooled beneath leaky pipes. The brightened beam of his flashlight illuminated the alley almost as well as overhead bulbs, but somehow the light was not comforting. It only made the place look dark and grim. The shelves of tools and rejected paint cans now woefully exposed. As he moved toward the door to the restaurant, something tiny and cool landed on his head, and he startled, swinging his light up like a weapon and pressing his back against the wall as defense against the threat. Another cold drop of water landed on his cheek. He took deep breaths. When at last he reached the outer door to the restaurant, the shelf that had been blocked, it was gone. The chains that had seemed so permanently fixed in place were hanging loose, and the door was cracked open slightly. The immense rusted padlock laid in the dirt, its shackles hanging open. Dunn kicked it away from the door. He dug his fingers into the gap, prying until he could get a grip on it, then pulled at the door with both hands until it screeched open wide enough for him to enter. He crept down the inner passage with his light held out in front, hanging the wall tight to one side. The air seemed to change as he moved closer to the interior of the restaurant, and Dunn felt a crawling chilling that penetrated to his uniform and fed his growing anxiety. "Don't freak out, Don," he said aloud, then felt instantly foolish. He reached the main dining area and stopped, sweeping the light over each wall in turn. The light seemed dimmer inside, swallowed by the space. The room was empty, but it was just as he remembered from when he was a kid. He had been 10 when the tragedies started, 11 when they ended. His birthday party was supposed to be at Freddy's, but after the first disappearance, his mother had canceled it, invited his friends to his house, and hired a clown, which proved equally terrifying. Smart move, Mom. Dunn thought. The beam played over the little carousel, which he had never ridden, and he was too old for it. Just before the beam of the light reached the stage, Dunn stopped, swallowing hard. The rabbit took him, the kid had said, then shook himself and played the light across the stage. The figures were there, just as he remembered, and unlike the carousel, they did not seem diminished in size. They were exactly as he recalled, and for a moment an almost painful nostalgia swelled in his chest. As he gazed at them, remembering, he noticed that their eyes were all fixed oddly forward, like they were watching something on the far side of the room. The flashlight trained in front of him. Dunn approached the stage until he was standing only a few feet from it, and he stared up at each of the animals in turn. Bonnie was holding his guitar gently as if he might begin strumming whenever the mood struck him, and Chica and her cupcake seemed to be sharing some arcane secret. Freddy, with his microphone, stared out into the distance, unblinking. Nothing moved behind him, and Dunn whirled around, his heart racing. The flashlight found nothing, and he swept it nervously from side to side, filling only empty tables. He glanced back nervously at Bonnie, but the rabbit was still frozen in his own indestructible reverie. Dunn took shallow breaths, holding himself completely still, and listened. His sense just kicked into high gear with adrenaline. After a moment, the noise came back again, a shuffling sound, this time coming from off to the right. He swept the light instantly toward it. There was an open doorway, and beyond it a hall. Crouching down, Dunn made his way down the hall, keeping to the side as though something might come running past. Why am I here alone? He knew the answer. The sergeant had taken the search seriously. In truth, neither had Dunn. After all, it was just the chief's son again, making trouble. It's probably just Carlton, Dunn reminded himself. He reached the end of the hall, where a door stood ajar. With one hand, Dunn gave the door an inward push, dropping it low and to the side as he did. The door swung inward, and nothing happened. He pulled the nightstick from his belt. Its heft was unfamiliar. He had never had much need for it in Hurricane. Now, though, he gripped its hard rubber handle like a lifeline. The office was not quite empty. There was a small desk, and a folded-up metal chair leaned against it. A large cabinet stood against one wall. Its door opened just a crack. There were no exits other than the one Dunn was standing in. He swept the light up and down the length of the cabin and took a deep breath. He bounced his nightstick lightly in his hand, reassuring himself of its presence, and carefully assured the small space. Standing to the side, he used the stick to open the door. Moving slowly, it came open easily, and again everything was still relieved. Don looked inside. The cabinet was empty, except for a costume. It was Bonnie, or rather, it was. The face was the same, but the rabbit's fur was yellow. It was slumped lifelessly against the back wall of the cabinet, its eyes dark, gaping holes. The rabbit, the rabbit took him. The kid hadn't been lying then. Carlton must have gotten someone to dress up in this outfit to help him play his trick. Still, Dunn's unease did not abandon. He did not want to touch the thing. He lowered his light and stuck his nightstick back in his belt, intending to go. Before he could turn, the costume pinched forward, landing on Dunn with the lifeless weight of a heavy corpse. For a moment, it did not move. Then all at once it was withering, violently grabbing at him with strong, inhuman hand. Dunn screamed, and this desperate high sound struggling as the rabbit grappled his shirt in his arms. Dunn felt a sudden vicious pain, and a small, detached part of his mind thought, he broke it. He broke my arm. But the pain was washed numb by terror as the rabbit swung him around and slammed him into the cabinet door, taking Dunn's weight easily as if he were a child. Dunn struggled to breathe. The rabbit's arm was pressed against his neck so tightly that every movement choked him. Just when he thought he was on the brink of passing out, the pressure lifted, and Dunn grasped with relief, clutching his throat. Then he saw the knife. The rabbit held a slim silver blade. Its big, matted paw should have been too clumsy, but Dunn knew as he stared down at it that the rabbit had done this before and would easily do it again. Dunn screamed an indistinguished shriek. He had no hope that he would be heard. It was only a guttural, despairing noise. He breathed deep and did it again. A vessel sound, his whole body vibrating with it, as if this could be somehow be defense against what happened next. The knife went in. Dunn felt it tear through skin and muscle, felt it sever things he could not name, to plant itself deep in his chest. As he seized with pain and terror, the rabbit pulled him closer, almost in an embrace. Dunn's head went light. He was losing consciousness. As he looked up, he could see 2 rows of smiling teeth, horrid and yellow, costume peeling at the edge of the mouth. The 2 gaping holes where eyes looked down at him. They were dark and hollow, but the creature drew near enough that Don could see smaller eyes peering back at him from deep within the mask. Then held Don's gaze patiently. Don felt his legs go numb, his vision cloudy. He wanted to scream again, to somehow voice his final outrage, but he could not move his face, could not raise the breath to cry out. The rabbit held him upright, supporting his weight, and his eyes were the last thing Dunn ever saw. Charlie unlocked the front door to our old house and looked back down the front steps. "You coming?" John was still staring on the bottom. John was still standing on the bottom steps, staring up at the house. He shivered a little before hurrying to join her. "Sorry," he said sheepishly. "I just had a weird feeling for a second." Charlie laughed without much humor. "Just for a second?" They were inside, and John stopped again, looking around the front door like he had just stepped into a sacred place. Somewhere the murder, and humbling pause. Charlie bit her tongue, trying not to be impatient. It was how she had felt as well. She might have felt the way now if she were not overwhelmed by a sense of urgency, and feeling that the answer to everything, the answer to how to get Carlton back must be somewhere in this place. Where else could it possibly be? John, she said, it's okay, come on. He nodded and followed her up the stairs to the second floor. He stopped again briefly halfway up, and Charlie saw his eyes fixed on the dark stain that marred the wood floor of the living room. He began to say, then swallowed it and started over. Is Stanley still there? Charlie pretended not to notice the lapse. You remember his name? He said, and instead, grinning, John shrugged. Who doesn't love a mechanical unicorn? Yeah, he's still there. All the toys still work. Come on. They hurried the rest of the way to her room. John knelt down beside the unicorn and pressed the button that set him on his track, watching rapidly as he made his squeakly way around the room. Charlie hid a smile behind her hand. John was watching intently, his face serious as if something very important were happening. For a moment he looked just like he had so many years ago, his hair falling into his face, his whole attention fixed on Stanley, like nothing in the world was more important than this robotic creature. Suddenly his attention was called upward, and his face lit up as he pointed. Your big girl closet. It's open, he explained, getting back to his feet and approaching the tallest of the three closets, which was hanging open slightly. He pulled it open all the way, then leaned in, finding it empty. So what was in it all those years? He asked. Not sure, Charlie said, with a shrug. I sort of remember Aunt Jane bringing me back at some point, but I could be wrong. Maybe it was full of clothes that I was finally big enough to wear. Aunt Jane was always thrifty. Why spend money on new clothes if you don't have to, right? She smiled. John glanced briefly at the smaller closet, but he left them alone. I'm going to see if I can find any photo albums on paperwork, Charlie said, and she nodded absently as Stanley rattled back to his starting point. As she left the room, she heard him starting up again, making another round on the track. The room had been her father's, was next to Charlie's. It was at the back of the house. It had too many windows. In the summer it was too hot, and in the winter the cold dribbled in like a present leak. But Charlie had known without being told why he used it. From here you could see the garage and his workshop. It had always made sense to Charlie. That was his place. Like a part of him always lived there, and he did not like to be too far away from his touchstone. Away from her dream came to her for a moment. Not even an image, just a strange eviction gesture of memory. She frowned, looking out the window at the closet, silent garage door. Closed silent garage door. Or maybe he just wanted to be sure nothing got out, she thought. She broke away from the window, shrugging her shoulders and shaking her hands, sloughing off the feeling. She looked around the room, like her own, It was all but untouched. She had not opened the drawers to her dresser, but for all she knew, it might still have been filled with shirts and socks, clean, folded, and ready to wear. His bed was made crisply, covered in the pale blanket he used as a bedspread after Charlie's mother left, and there was no one in sight on white lining. There was a large bookcase against one wall, and it was still stuffed with books. Charlie went over and began scanning the shelves. Many were textbooks, engineering tomes whose titles meant nothing to her, and the rest were nothing, a collection that would have seemed electric to anyone who did not know the man. There were books on biology and anatomy, some on human beings and others on animals. There were books about the history of the traveling carnival of the circus. There were books about children's development, about myths and legends, and about sewing patterns and techniques. There were volumes that claimed to be about trickster gods, about quilting bees, and a football cheering squad and their mascots. On the very top shelf were stacks of file folders, and the bottom shelf was empty except for a single book, a photo album, leather bound and as pristine as time and dust could allow. Charlie grabbed it, and it stuck for a moment, almost too tall for the low shelf it had been given. After a minute, it came free, and she headed back to her bedroom, leaving the door open with the sudden sense that it closed, she might never get back in. John was sitting on the bed when she returned, looking at Stanley with his head tilted to the side. "What?" Charlie said, and he looked up, still pensive. "I was wondering if he's been lonely," he said, then shrugged. "He's got Theodore," Charlie said, pointing to the stuffed rabbit with a smile. "It's Ella who's all alone in the closet." "What?" He placed the album beside John on the bed and went to its foot, then turned the wheel that set Ellen on her track. She sat down beside him, and they watched together, spellbound as of old, as the little doll came out in her crisp, clean dress to blanket off heat. Neither of them spoke until the smallest closet door closed behind her. John cleared his throat. "So what's in the book?" "Photos," Charlie said. "I haven't looked at them yet." He picked up the album and opened it at random. The top picture was of her mother holding a baby, maybe a year old. She held the child above her head, flying it like an airplane, her head thrown back in the midst of a laugh, her long brown hair swinging out in an arc behind her. The baby's eyes were wide, its mouth open in delight. John smiled at her. "You look so happy," he said, and she nodded. "Yeah," she said, "I guess I must have been, if that's me." He did not add aloud. He opened to another page where the only picture was a large family portrait, stiffly posed at a studio. They were dressed formally. Charlie's father was wearing a suit. Her mother was in a bright pink dress with padding that lifted her shoulders almost to her ears, and her brown hair was straightened flat in place. Each of them was holding a baby, one in a white frilly dress and one in a sailor suit. Charlie's heart skipped, and beside her she heard John take a sharp, quick breath. She looked at him with a feeling like the floor was dropping away beneath them. "It was real," she said. "I didn't imagine him." John said nothing in response, just nodded. He put a hand on her shoulder briefly, and then they turned back to the photo album. "We all look so happy." Charlie said softly. I think you were, John said. Look, you had such a goofy smile. He pointed and Charlie laughed. The whole book was like that. The first memories of a happy family who expected there to be many more. They are not arranged chronologically, so Charlie and Sammy appeared as toddlers, then as newborns, then at various stages in between, except on formal occasions when Charlie was put into a dress, of which there seemed to be few. It was impossible to tell which baby was which. There were no traces of Freddy Fazbear Diner. Near the back of the book, Charlie came to a portfolio of her and Sammy together, infants, bright red and squealing on their back, wearing nothing but diapers and hospital wrists. On the white space below the pictures, someone had written Mommy's Boy and Daddy's Girl. The rest of the pages were blank. Charlie went back again, opening at random to find a strip from a photo booth, 4 shots of her parents alone. They smiled at each other, then made faces at the camera, then laughing, missing the chance to pose, blurring their faces. Lastly, they smiled into the lens. Her mother was grinning happily at the camera, her face alit and flushed, but her father was staring into the distance, a smile fixed on his face like he had left it there by mistake. His darkened eyes were intense, remote, and Charlie resisted a sudden urge to look behind her, as if she might see whatever it was he was looking at. She peeled back the cell phone from the album's page and took the strip out and folded it in half, careful to place the crease between pictures, leaving them intact. She slipped the pictures into her pocket and looked at John, who was watching her again as if she were some kind of unpredictable creature he needed to be careful around. What? She said. Shirley, you know I don't think he did it right. You said that. I'm serious. It's not just what Carlton's dad said. I knew him, as well as a kid can know someone else's kid's dad. He wouldn't do it. I wouldn't believe it. He spoke with calm certainty, like someone who believed that the world was made out of facts and tangible things, and that there was such a thing as truth. Charlie nodded. I know, she said. He took her next breath slowly, gathering the words she would speak with it. But I might. His eyes widened, startled, and she looked up at the ceiling for a minute, briefly trying to remember if all the cracks had been there when she was a child. I don't mean I think he did it. I don't think that, he said. I don't think about it at all. I can't. I shut the whole thing off in my mind the day I left Hurricane. I don't think about Freddy. I don't think about what happened, and I don't think about him. John was looking at her like she was monstrous, like what she was saying was the worst thing he had ever heard. I don't understand how you can say things like that, he said quietly. You loved him. How can you even consider the possibility that he would do something so terrible? Even the people who do terrible things have people who love them. Shirley was looking for words. I don't think he did it. I'm not saying that, he said again. And again the words hit the air as flimsy as paper. But I remember him dressing up for us in the yellow Freddy suit, doing the dances, mimicking along with the song. It was so much a part of him. He was the restaurant. There was no one else, and he was always so distant. Like in that picture, there was always something else going on beneath the surface. It was like he had real life and a secret life, you know? John nodded and looked about to speak, but Charlie rushed on before he could. We were the secret life. His real life was his work. It was what mattered. We were his guilty pleasure. The things he got to love and sneak away to have time with. Something he kept hidden away from the dangers of what he did in his real world. And when he was with us, there was always a part of him that was back in reality. Whatever that was for him. Again, John opened his mouth, but Charlie snapped the photo album shut, stood up, and left the room. John didn't follow right away, and as she traversed the short hall to her father's bedroom, she could almost hear him making up his mind. Not waiting for him, she went to the bookshelf, wanting to get the book out of her hand, like maybe if it were closed up and put away, her mind too returned to its normal order. The book would not fit, and she dropped to her knees to get a better angle, trying to jam the thing back where it belongs, get it out of her hand. The shelf seemed to have shrunk down while she was gone, so that it could never be returned, never put right. With a cry of frustration, Charlie shoved the photo album in as hard as she could. The shelf rocked back and then forward, and sudden mass of papers and file folders tumbled from above her. Charlie began to cry as pages drifted down around her, covering the floor like snow as she wept. Swiftly, John was there. He knelt down with her in the delicate racket, putting papers away as quickly as he could without tearing them. He put a hand on her shoulder carefully, and she did not move away. He pulled her closer and held her, and she hugged him back, gripping so tight she knew she must be hurting him, but she could not let go. She sobbed harder, as if being held, being contained, made it safe to let go. Long minutes passed. John stroked her hair, and Charlie still cried, her body shaking with the force of it, shuddering like she was possessed. She was not thinking of what happened, not flittering from one memory to the next to mourn from them all. Her mind was all but blank. She held nothing, was nothing, but this feeling of breaking sob. Her face was sore with tension. Her chest hurt like all her pain was being forced out through its wall. And she still cried as if she would cry forever. But forever was an illusion. Slowly her breathing calmed, and finally Charlie returned to herself and pushed away from John's shoulder, exhausted. Once again, John was left with his arms partially suspended in the air. Caught off guard by their sudden emptiness, he tried to move out of the awkward pose without calling attention to himself. Charlie sat back against the side of her father's bed, leaning her head against it. He felt wrung out, drenched thin and aged, but she felt a little better. She gave John a tiny smile, and she saw relief pass over his face at the first sign that she might be all right. "I'm okay," she said. "It's just this place, it's all this," she felt, slowly trying to explain, but John stood back to sit with her. "Charlie, you don't have to explain. I know what happened." "Do you?" She looked at him searchingly, not sure how to put the question. It seemed too crude, too graphic to say it outright. "Do you know how my dad died, John?" He looked immediately nervous. "I know he killed himself," he said hesitantly. "No, I mean, do you know how?" "Oh," John looked down at his feet as if he could not meet her eyes. "I thought he stabbed himself," he said quickly. "I remember hearing my mom and dad talk. She said something about a knife and all the blood. There was a knife, Charlie said, and there was blood. She closed her eyes and kept them shut as she talked. She could feel John's eyes on her face, watching every movement. But she knew if she looked at him, she would not be able to finish. I never saw it, she said. I never saw the body. I don't know if you remember, but my aunt came to get me at school in the middle of the day. She stopped, waiting for confirmation. Her eyes shut tight. I remember, John's voice said from the darkness. It was the last time I ever saw you. Yeah, she came and got me, and I knew something was wrong. You don't go home from school in the middle of the day because everything's fine. She took me outside to her car, but we didn't get in right away. She picked me up and sat me on the hood of the car, and she told me she loved me. I love you, Charlie, and everything is going to be okay, Aunt Jane said, and then she destroyed the world with the next words she spoke. She told me that my father had died, and she asked if I knew what that meant. And Charlie nodded because she didn't know, and because with an awful presence, she was not surprised. She said I was going to stay with her for a couple of days, and we would go get some clothes from the house. When we got there, she picked me up like I was a little kid, and as we went through the door, she covered my face with her hand so I wouldn't see what was in the living room, because I did see. It was one of his creatures, one she had never seen, and it was facing the stairs. Its head was bowed a little so that Charlie could see that the black back of its skull was open, the circuits exposed, the limbs and joints lay bare, a skeleton of naked metal strung with twisting wires of bloodless circulation, and its arms were outstretched in a lonesome facelum of an embrace. It was standing in the middle of a dark, still pool of some liquid that seemed, though it must have been incredible, to be spreading. He could see its face, if it could be called a face. Its features were scarcely formed, crude, shapeless. Even so, Charlie could see that they were contorted, almost potion. The thing would be sweeping, if it could have swept. He stared at it for ages, though it could have been less than seconds, no more than a glimpse as Aunt James swept her up the stairs. Yet she had seen it so many times since then, when she slept, when she woke, when she urgently closed her eyes, it would appear to her, the face pressing its way into her mind as if it had pressed into the world. Its blind eyes were only raised bumps like the eyes of a statue, seeing nothing but its own grief. In its hand, almost an afterthought, was the knife, and Charlie saw the knife, the whole thing snapped into focus. She knew what the thing was, and she knew what it had been built for. John was staring at her, horror creeping in. That's how he trailed off. Charlie nodded, of course. He made a move to confront her again, but it was the wrong thing to do. Without thinking, Charlie moved slightly, leaping out of reach, and his face fell. Sorry, she said quickly. Sorry. John shook his head quickly and turned to the jumble of papers on the floor. We should look through these, see if there's anything here, he said. Sure, she said, wistfully dismissing his attempts at reassurance. They began randomly. Everything had fallen in such a mess that there was no other way to begin. Most of the papers were engineer blueprints and pages of inquisitions, and incomprehensible to them both. There was tax forms, which John took up eagerly, hoping for information about Freddy's family diner. But he gave up with a sigh after 15 minutes, cleaning the papers down. Charlie, I can't figure this out. Let's check through the rest, but I don't think puzzling at it is going to turn us into mathematics or accounts. Stubbornly, Charlie kept picking through the papers, hoping for something she would understand. She picked up a sheaf of paper, trying to straighten the next stack, and a photograph fell out of the pile. John snatched it up. Charlie, look, he said. Suddenly excited, she took it from his hand. It was her father in his workshop, wearing the yellow Freddy Fazbear costume. The head was tucked under his arm, staring slightly into the camera, but Charlie's father was smiling, his face pink and sweaty as if he had been in the costume for a long time. Beside him was the yellow Bonnie. The yellow rabbit, Charlie said. Jason said there was a yellow rabbit. But your father's in the bear costume. The rabbit must be a robot, Charlie said. Look at the eyes. They're red. She peered closer. The eyes were glittering red, but they weren't glowing. And in a moment she saw why. It's not red eyes. It's red eye. There's a person in there. So who? Who is in the suit? Charlie finished the question for him. We have to go to the library, John said, jumping to his feet. Charlie stayed where she was, still staring down at the picture. Charlie? Yeah, she said. He held out a hand to pull her up as they descended the staircase. John hung back briefly, but Charlie did not turn around. She knew what he was imagining, because she was picturing it too, the stain on the floor, slowly spreading. Charlie drove fast to the library, a grim urgency hanging over her. The promised storm was in the air, the smell of it rising like a warning. In a strange way, the wholesome weather satisfied something in Charlie. Storm inside, storms outside. I've never been this eager to get to a library, John joked, and she smiled tightly, without humor. The main library in Hurricane was next to the elementary school, where they had gone for the memorial ceremony. And as they got out of the car, Charlie glanced at the playground, envisioning children screaming and laughing as they ran circles, immersed in their games. We were so young. They hurried up the few steps to the library together. A squared, modern brick building that looked as if it had come paired with the school beside it. She only remembered the library vaguely from her childhood. They had gone infrequently, and Charlie had spent all her time there sitting on the floor in the children's section. Being able to see over the information desk was slightly discouraging. The library was young, Charlie thought, an athletic-seeming woman in slacks and purple sweater. She smiled brightly. What can I do for you? She said. Charlie hesitated. The woman was maybe in her late 20s. Charlie realized that ever since she returned to Hurricane, he had been paying attention to age, emphasizing each face and calculating how old they had been when it happened. The woman had been a teenager. It doesn't matter, she thought. You still have to ask. She opened her mouth to ask for information about Freddy's bears. but what came out instead was, "Are you from Hurricane?" The librarian shook her head. "No, I'm from India." Charlie felt her body relax. She wasn't here. "Do you have any information on a place called Freddy Bear's Family Diner?" Charlie asked, and the woman frowned. "Do you mean Freddy Fazbear's?" "They used to have one of those here, I think," she said vaguely. "No, that's not the one," Charlie said, ready to endlessly patient with the librarian, who was thankfully probably the only person in town who was somehow unaware of her history. "Well, for town records, things like incorporation and licensing, you would have to go to the city hall, but it's..." Charlie checked her watch. "It's after 5, so not today anyway. I have newspapers all the way back to the 1880s if you want to look at microfilms," she said eagerly. "Yeah, okay," Charlie said. "I'm Harriet," the woman said as she led them to a door at the back of the building. They recited their names beautifully, and she chatted on like a child about to display her favorite toy. "So, you know what microfilm is, right? It's because we can't keep stacks and stacks of papers here. There's no room, and eventually they would rot, so it's a way to preserve them. They take pictures and save them. The film, it's almost like a movie reel, you know? Very small, so you need a machine to see it."
Hello, alright, it's my turn now. We know what it is, John cut in when she paused. We just don't know how to use it. Well, that's what I'm here for, Harriet declared, and threw the door open. Inside was a table with a computer monitor. The monitor sat on top of little boxes with a small wheel on each side. Two handles stuck out in front. Charlie and John looked at it dismally, and Harry grinned. "You want the local paper, right? What years?" Charlie counted backward. 1979 to 1982, she hazarded. Harriet beamed and left the room. John bent forward to peer at the machine, rattling the handle a little. "Careful," Charlie warned jokingly. "I think she might be lost without that thing." John raised his hands to his shoulders and stepped back. Harriet reappeared with what looked like 4 small movie reels and held them up. "What year do you want to start with?" she said. 1979, I guess, Charlie said, and Harriet nodded. She went to the machine and threaded the film through very professionally. She flipped the switch and the screen came to life. A newspaper appeared. "January 1st, 1979, John announced, leaning forward to read the headlines. "Politics, somebody won a sports game, and there was some weather. Also, there was a bakery giving away free cookies to celebrate the New Year. Sounds like now, except no cookie." "You use these to see more," Harriet said, manipulating the controls. "Let me know if you need help switching the reels. Have fun, you two," she winked conspicuously and closed the door behind her as she left. Charlie positioned herself in front of the machine and John stood behind her, his hands on her chair. It felt good to have him close, like he would stop anything that tried to sneak up on her. "This is pretty cool," he remarked, and she nodded, scanning the papers for answers. "Okay, let's narrow it down," he said gleamingly. "What's the most likely thing to make the papers?" "I was looking for an opening announcement," Charlie said. "Yeah, but what's going to make the papers?" "Sorry," he added. "I didn't want to say it, but we have to..." "Sammy," Charlie said. We have to start with Sammy. We moved to the new house when I was 3. It's got to be 1982. Carefully, they switched the reel. Charlie eyed the door as they did, as if nervous that Harriet might catch them making a mistake. When's your birthday? John said, sitting to take her place. Don't you know? She teased. He screwed up his face in an exaggerated mime of thanking. May 13th, he said at last. She laughed, startled. How did you know? He grinned up at her. 'Cause I know things, he said. But why does it matter? You remember 3 when you were moved, but you don't turn 3 until May, so we knocked out 5 months. Do you remember anything about the restaurant the night Sammy disappeared? Charlie felt herself flinch with almost physical pain. Sorry, she said. Her face felt too hot. Sorry you startled me. Let me think. She closed her eyes. The restaurant, the closet, full with costumes. She and Sammy there, safe in the dark, until the door opened, and the rabbit appeared leaning over them with its awful face, its human eyes. Charlie's heart was racing. She slowed her breath and held out a hand. John took hold of it. He held on tight as if he could anchor her. The rabbit leaning over them, the yellow teeth beneath the mask and behind the rabbit. What was behind the rabbit? The restaurant was open. She could hear voices, people. There were more people in costumes, other performers, robots. No. She almost had it. Securely breathing, Charlie tried to coax out the thought, scared to frighten it away. Move slowly, speak softly. She had it, snatched from its depths of her mind and held it wiggling in her fingers. Her eyes snapped up. John, I know when it was, she said. Early that night, when they were still wide awake, the closet opened and her mother looked in. She was half by the light from behind her, smiling down at her twins, radiating in her long, elegant dress, her flowing hair, her gleaming tiara. Mommy's princess, Charlie muttered sleepily, and her mother bent down and kissed her cheek. Just for tonight, she whispered, and then she left them in the dark to sleep. She was a princess, she said excitedly. What? Who? My mother, Charlie said. She was dressed up as a princess. It was Halloween party. John, go to November 1st. John struggled briefly with the controls, and then it was there. The headline was small, but it was on the front page of the paper on Monday. November 1st. Toddler snatched. Charlie turned away. John began to read out loud, and Charlie cut in, stopping him. Don't, she said. It's only if it has anything awful. He was quiet. She stared anxiously at the door, waiting, tracing the knobs and the false wood with her eyes. There's a picture, he said finally. You need to look. He leaned over his shoulder. The story had continued over an entire page inside, with pictures of the restaurant, of the family all together, and of her and Sammy, though neither of the twins were named in the arc. In the bottom left corner, there was a picture of her father and another man. Their arms were slugged around each other's shoulders, and they were grinning happily. John, Charlie said. It says they were joint owners, John said quickly. No, Charlie said, unable to take her eyes off from the picture, from the face they both knew. Suddenly, the door behind them interrupted, and pondering from outside, and they both jumped. Charlie, John, are you in there? Marla, they said as one, and Charlie rushed to the door and threw it open. Marla, what is it? She was red-faced and breathless, and Harriet was anxiously hovering behind her. Marla's hair was wet, water dripping down her face, but she did not wipe it away or even seem to notice. I guess the rain started, Charlie thought. The mundane reflection drifting unbinding into her head despite her alarm. He's gone. Jason's gone, Marla cried. What? John said. He's gone back to Freddy's. I know he has, she said. He's kept saying we should go back, that we should just be hanging around all day. I thought he was in the other room. But I looked everywhere. I know that's where he is, she said. It all in one breath and ended gasping, a faint, whining hum, resonating under her breath. A kneeing sound she seemed unable to stop making. Oh no, Charlie said. Come on, Marla pressed. She was jittering, vibrating. John put a hand on her shoulder as if to comfort her, and she shook her head. Don't try to calm me down, just come with me, she insisted. For there was no anger, only desperation. She turned, almost ran to the door, and John and Charlie followed with an apologetic look for the small library they left behind them. So on behalf of all of this, and I get to end it since I got the smallest speaking role, I'm Cherry, and it has, along with Smoke and Snooky. We will see you next time. Bye!